The Brown Palace Hotel, downtown Denver. The grand opening night of Knox Sheridan's newest restaurant. A name half the city didn't dare say out loud. Second floor ballroom. Warm light. Long tables draped in white linen. Over 200 guests, business owners, attorneys, politicians. Everyone here understood one rule. Knox never invited anyone twice. In the corner, the Cole family sat at table 14. Donald Cole, the father, wore a borrowed suit, his fingers locked around a wine glass. Janet, the mother, sat beside him, her eyes darting around the room as if terrified someone might realize she didn't belong here. Wesley, the younger brother, tried flashing a polite smile at the table next to him. No one smiled back. Then the main doors opened. Knox Sheridan walked in. The room didn't go silent, but the noise dropped by half. Tall, black, three-piece suit. No smile, no nod to anyone. He moved at a steady pace, unhurried, like a man who already knew exactly how the night would unfold. But the person who made the entire room look up wasn't Knox. It was the woman beside him, and the little girl holding her hand, Meredith Cole, 27 years old. Back straight, step steady, eyes forward. Next to her, Paige, 6 years old, wore a new floral dress, her hair neatly braided, round eyes taking in the ballroom. She tilted her head toward her mother and whispered, "Mommy, it's so bright in here. It's like a castle." Meredith smiled and held her daughter's hand tighter. Donald saw them. The wine glass slipped from his fingers, hit the stone floor, and shattered. But he didn't bend down to pick it up. He didn't look at Meredith either. He looked at Paige, the granddaughter he'd tried to push out of his house on a winter night 2 years ago. Now she was smiling, holding her mother's hand. Walking through a room that he himself needed a borrowed suit just to sit in. Wesley's face went pale. Janet covered her mouth. And Donald, he stood frozen, feet locked to the floor, eyes fixed on the little girl who thought she was standing inside a castle. 2 years ago, Meredith Cole carried Paige out of her parents' house at 3 in the morning. The girl was 4 then, fast asleep on her mother's shoulder. On Meredith's back was a single backpack. Nothing else. No money. No shelter. Not a single relative who looked back. This is the story of how a woman her own family called a curse walked from nothing to this very room, to this very spot, on this very night. If this story touched your heart, hit like and share it so more people can hear it. And if you want to follow the next stories, subscribe to our channel. Every story carries a lesson worth thinking about. 2 years earlier, Meredith Cole stood in front of her parents' house in the suburbs of Denver, holding Paige in her arms, a backpack strapped to her back. She hadn't called ahead. She hadn't given any warning. Because until 12 hours earlier, she'd still thought she had a home, a husband, and a normal life. But 12 hours earlier, she'd discovered that all of it had been a lie. Kyle Brennan, her husband, had used her name to sign for 4 loans, totaling more than $120,000. Then he disappeared. The bank account was empty. The rented apartment had already received an eviction notice from the landlord. Meredith held her 4-year-old daughter, carried the only backpack she had, and drove her old car for 3 hours from the city back to the suburbs. She had no choice left except her parents' door. Donald opened it, looked at his daughter, looked at the granddaughter dozing against her mother's shoulder, then looked at the backpack. He didn't ask what had happened. He only said one sentence. "Only for a little while." Then he turned his back and walked inside. Janet stood behind the kitchen door and didn't come out to greet her. She only took an old set of blankets and placed it on the living room sofa. That first night, Meredith and Paige slept on that sofa. Paige curled up in her mother's arms, while Meredith lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the house where she'd grown up, wondering why it felt so strange, so distant, so unfamiliar. The first week passed in silence. Donald didn't ask Meredith about Kyle, didn't ask about the debt, didn't ask what she planned to do next. He went to work at the furniture store, came home for dinner, watched television, and went to bed, as if Meredith didn't exist. Janet was different. She spoke to Meredith, but only in unfinished sentences. "Our family didn't used to be like this." Or, "Ever since you went off and got married, your father's had it hard too." Meredith listened and didn't answer. She understood those sentences weren't meant as concern. They were Janet's way of reminding her that she'd brought a burden back home. Then everything began to collapse. In the second week, Donald's furniture store had an electrical short, and part of the warehouse burned. The damage was nearly $40,000. The insurance company refused to pay because the premium records showed payments were 2 months late, a mistake Donald had overlooked long before Meredith came back, but no one mentioned that. In the third week, Wesley drove into the neighbor's fence after coming home late from a night out. The family had to pay $12,000 in compensation. Wesley apologized to his father once, then went upstairs and shut his door. Donald didn't say anything to his son, but that night, Meredith heard Janet speaking to Donald in their bedroom, her voice low, but clear enough to hear. Ever since Meredith came back, this family hasn't had one peaceful day. The store burned. Wesley had an accident. Don't you think that's strange? Donald didn't answer. But from that day on, he stopped looking at Meredith. Not even once. Wesley moved faster. He realized Meredith was the easiest target for everyone to blame, and he took full advantage of it. He moved Meredith and Paige's things from the living room into the garage without saying a word beforehand. He told Janet, "Every extra day she stays here, this family gets one more day of bad luck. Don't you see that, Mom?" Janet heard him and didn't object. She only sighed, then nodded. Meredith knew she was being backed into a corner, but she didn't argue. Not because she agreed, but because she understood that in this house, the truth mattered less than belief. And the whole family's belief had already been decided. Meredith was the cause of everything terrible. Then came that night. Meredith was sitting in the kitchen, feeding Paige. The little girl sat in her high chair, her legs swinging, holding a spoon and scooping up noodles. Donald walked in to get water. He saw Meredith, saw Paige, then stopped. He set the glass of water down on the table, turned to Meredith, and said in a voice that wasn't loud, but carried each word like stone, "I don't know what you brought into this house, but since the day you walked in, everything has fallen apart." Then he picked up the glass of water and walked out of the kitchen. No shouting, no pounding on the table. Just one sentence, even, cold, and dead. Meredith sat still. Her hand was still holding the napkin she'd been using to wipe Paige's mouth. She didn't tremble, didn't cry, didn't stand up and chase after him to explain herself. She only sat there, looking at her daughter. Paige looked up, noodle broth still clinging to her mouth, and asked, "Mommy, why is Grandpa so mad?" Meredith wiped her daughter's mouth and smiled softly. "Grandpa's just tired, sweetheart. Keep eating." Paige nodded and scooped up another spoonful of noodles. And Meredith sat there watching her daughter eat, while inside her mind, something had changed. She didn't know what would happen that night. She only knew that this house no longer had room for her, and maybe it never had. 2 weeks after Donald said those words, no one in the Cole house ever brought it up again. There was no family meeting, no ultimatum, no one looking Meredith straight in the face and saying, "You have to leave." They didn't need to say it. They used other ways. Janet was the one who started. One morning, Meredith opened the refrigerator to get milk for Paige and saw a small lock hooked across the handle. Janet hadn't said a word to Meredith, but on the shelf in the hallway, she'd left a cheap box of cereal and 2 bottles of water, as if that were the ration meant for someone staying in the house out of charity. Meredith looked at the lock, looked at the box of cereal, then turned back into the garage. She opened the box and poured cereal into a bowl for Paige. The little girl ate happily and didn't ask why there was no milk that day. The next day, the house Wi-Fi password was changed. Meredith asked Janet, and Janet said, "Your father changed it. I don't know the new password." Meredith didn't ask a second time. She carried Paige and walked to the public library 20 minutes from the house, using the free Wi-Fi to look for jobs on her phone. On the third day, Wesley locked the laundry room door. Meredith took their clothes to the laundromat down the street and paid with the coins she still had left in the pocket of her old coat. Every day, something was cut off. Every day, another door inside the house closed in front of her. No noise, no arguments. Just everything slowly disappearing, as if the house itself were shrinking, pushing her out bit by bit. But Meredith didn't argue. She knew that in this house, anything she said would be used to prove she was a burden. So, she stayed silent. She woke earlier than everyone else, cooked porridge for Paige with rice she bought herself, then took her daughter outside before anyone woke up. She avoided Donald. She avoided Wesley. She tried to make herself as small as possible inside the very house where she'd grown up, so no one would have a reason to say she was in the way. Paige didn't know what was happening. She was 4 years old, and her world was her mother, her bowl of morning porridge, and afternoons at the library, where her mother read books to her. Meredith kept everything looking normal in her child's eyes, even though behind it all, nothing was normal at all. Then came the 14th night. Meredith was lying on the old mattress in the garage, Paige curled beside her, already sound asleep. The house was quiet. Then Meredith heard Donald's footsteps crossing the hallway and going into the bedroom. The bedroom door closed, but not all the way. Donald's voice carried out, not loud, but clear in every word. "Tomorrow, I'm calling someone to change the locks. If she wants to stay, she can sleep in the yard." Janet said nothing. She didn't object. She didn't ask again. There was only the faint creak of the bed as she lay down. Meredith lay in the garage, eyes open, staring up at the black ceiling. Her hand tightened around the edge of the blanket. She lay like that for 10 minutes, 20 minutes. Then she sat up. Not because she was afraid, not because she was angry, but because she looked over at Paige sleeping beside her, hair spread across the pillow, her face peaceful, and she thought, if they stayed one more day, her little girl would begin to understand. She would understand that her grandfather didn't want her there. She would understand that her mother was hated, and Meredith wouldn't allow that to happen. Meredith stood, took the backpack, and packed a few sets of clothes for both of them. The last carton of milk, her notebook, and the old laptop. She put on her coat, then turned to Paige. Gently, she dressed her daughter in a thicker coat, zipped it carefully, and smoothed her hair into place. Paige didn't wake up. The little girl only made a soft, sleepy sound, then sank back into sleep. Meredith lifted her daughter onto her shoulder, picked up the backpack, and walked to the back door of the garage. She didn't go through the living room. She didn't knock on her parents' bedroom door. She didn't leave a letter. She didn't leave anything at all. 3 o'clock in the morning, January, Denver. Meredith stepped outside with Paige on her shoulder and the backpack on her back. She crossed the backyard, opened the gate in the fence, and stepped onto the sidewalk. The street was empty. The streetlights glowed a pale yellow. There was no one there. She didn't look back. She didn't look up at her parents' bedroom window. She didn't look at the house again, not even once. She only kept walking, one step, then another. Paige slept deeply on her mother's shoulder, not knowing this was the last time she would ever sleep under her grandparents' roof. Meredith drove the old car through the night, not knowing where to go. Paige slept soundly in the back seat, hugging her little backpack as if it were a teddy bear. Meredith drove through downtown, through empty streets, through intersections where red lights blinked at 4 o'clock in the morning. She had no address to go to, no one to call. In the end, she turned into the parking lot of a Walmart in the suburbs, a place open 24 hours, with bright lights, security cameras, and no one asking why a car was parked there overnight. She turned off the engine, reclined the seat, and stared up at the roof of the car. The parking lot was wide and empty, with only a few delivery trucks parked in the far corner. Meredith sat that way until morning came. On the first day, she went into Walmart and bought a small carton of milk and a few packs of cookies for Paige. She counted every coin and bill in her wallet. Less than $40 remained. That afternoon, she drove to a nearby park and let Paige run across the grass. The little girl was so happy, running back and forth, chasing pigeons, laughing in bright, breathless bursts. By evening, when mother and daughter returned to the parking lot, Paige climbed into the back seat, curled herself in the blanket, and asked, "Mommy, are we sleeping in the car again tonight? This is so fun, just like camping." Meredith smiled. "Yes, we're camping." The little girl nodded, closed her eyes, and fell asleep within 5 minutes. The second day was like the first. Milk in the morning, the park in the afternoon, then back to the parking lot at night. Meredith washed their clothes in the sink of a nearby gas station restroom and laid them across the back seat of the car to dry. She ate less so Paige would have enough. 1 carton of milk and 2 packs of cookies. That was her daughter's daily ration. Meredith drank water from public taps and ate whatever was left. By the third day, the money in her wallet wasn't even $20. Meredith sat in the driver's seat, Paige asleep behind her, and she knew this way of living couldn't last more than a few more days. She needed work. She needed a roof over their heads. She needed a plan. But her head was tangled, exhausted, and afraid. Then came the fourth day. Meredith was rearranging the box of things in the car when she found a crumpled bill at the bottom. It was the bill for the first loan Kyle had taken out in her name. She held the paper, looked at the numbers printed on it, and instead of crying or crushing it in her hand and throwing it away, something in her mind clicked, like a switch turning on. She turned the bill over, took a pen from the box, and began to write. First loan, $35,000, 14% interest, 60-month term. Second loan, $28,000, 18% interest. She wrote each line, each number, each deadline. The instincts of a woman who had graduated with honors in finance didn't vanish just because she was sitting in an old car in a Walmart parking lot. She filled the back of the bill with writing. Then she looked at what she'd just written. For the first time in 4 days, she didn't see everything as a tangled mess anymore. It was still bad. Still debt. Still no home. No job. No one beside her. But once it was written out line by line, debt by debt, number by number, it was no longer a bomb. It was a problem, and problems could be solved. The fifth day. Meredith woke before Paige, as she always did. The sky was still dim, and the parking lot lights cast a pale yellow glow through the car windows. She sat in the driver's seat, looking outside, then looked at the calendar on her phone. January 17th, Paige's birthday. She was turning 5. Meredith sat still for a while. Last year, Paige's birthday had a 2-tier cake, princess-shaped candles, Kyle taking pictures, and a small but warm apartment. This year, her little girl would wake up in the back seat of an old car in a Walmart parking lot. Meredith closed her eyes, took a deep breath, then opened them again. She opened her wallet and counted the money. $14.60 left. She got out of the car and walked into the convenience section inside Walmart. She went down the aisles, looking at the price of each item. In the end, she chose one chocolate muffin, the kind kept in a clear plastic box, priced at $2.49. A small carton of milk, $1.20. She brought them to the checkout counter. The cashier was a young woman with her hair tied in a ponytail, chewing gum. Meredith placed the muffin and the milk on the counter, then asked, "Could I have one match, please?" The girl looked at her, a little surprised, then searched under the counter, took out a small matchbox, pulled out one match, and handed it to Meredith. "Whose birthday is it?" the girl asked. "My daughter's," Meredith said. "She's 5. The girl looked at the muffin, looked at the match, then looked at Meredith. She didn't ask anything else. She only said, "Happy birthday" to her. Meredith nodded, took the bag, and walked out. That afternoon, after taking Paige to play at the park, mother and daughter returned to the car. Meredith said, "Paige, do you know what day it is today?" Paige tilted her head, thought for a moment, then cried out, "My birthday." Meredith smiled. "That's right. Mommy has a present for you." She opened the plastic box, took out the chocolate muffin, and set it on the lid of the box like a little plate. Then she stuck the match into the center of the muffin, crooked because the match was a little too long for the cake. Paige stared at it, her eyes shining. "Mommy, it has a candle too." "Yes, it has a candle too," Meredith said, then struck the match. A tiny flame flared up, glowing softly inside the car. The light reflected in Paige's eyes, on the car windows, and on Meredith's hand as she held the match steady. "Close your eyes and make a wish," Meredith said. Paige closed her eyes. She clasped both hands in front of her chest, her lips moving as if she were whispering to someone. Then she opened her eyes, drew in a deep breath, puffed out her cheeks, and blew. The match went out. A thin trail of smoke rose inside the car. Paige clapped her hands. "I did it, Mommy." Meredith smiled, but her voice was a little choked. "You did so well. What did you wish for?" Paige looked at her mother. The little girl tilted her head, as if weighing whether she should say it. Then she spoke, her voice light and soft. "I wished Mommy wouldn't be sad anymore." Meredith couldn't say anything. She sat there, her mouth slightly open, looking at her daughter. Paige was 5. She didn't know their family was more than $100,000 in debt. She didn't know her grandfather had changed the locks. She didn't know her mother had only $12 left in her wallet. But she knew her mother was sad. And the only thing she wanted to wish for on her birthday wasn't a toy, wasn't a cake, wasn't a room with a bed. It was for her mother not to be sad anymore. Meredith pulled her daughter into her arms and held her tightly, pressing her face into Paige's hair. She didn't cry. Not yet. She only held her daughter and felt as if someone were squeezing the air from her chest. Paige patted her mother's back. "Mommy, eat the cake. It's really good." Then the little girl sat back down, broke the muffin in half, and handed the bigger half to her mother. "This half is yours." Meredith took the piece of cake and bit off a small mouthful. "It's so good." Paige grinned, biting into her own piece, chocolate sticking to the corner of her mouth. Mother and daughter sat in the back seat, eating muffin and drinking milk inside the old car parked in the Walmart lot. Outside, people walked back and forth, pushing shopping carts, living their normal lives. No one knew that inside that car, a little girl who had just turned 5 was eating the happiest birthday party of her life. That night, Paige fell asleep earlier than usual. She lay curled in the back seat, still holding the half-finished carton of milk in her hand, chocolate still smudged around her mouth, her face content. Meredith gently took the milk carton from her daughter's hand, wiped Paige's mouth, and pulled the blanket over her. Then she moved up to the driver's seat. She sat there, both hands resting on the steering wheel, looking out at the empty parking lot. And for the first time since the night she left her parents' house, Meredith cried. Tears slid down her face. She wiped them away with her sleeve, and then they came again. She didn't cry because she was hungry, didn't cry because she was tired, didn't cry because of the debt, or because her parents had driven her out. She cried because her 5-year-old daughter, on her birthday, had wished for only one thing, for her mother not to be sad. She cried for a long time. Then she stopped, wiped her face, opened her phone, went into the Notes app, and typed each word with fingers that were still trembling. "Don't let anyone have the power to take my child away anymore. Need money. Need a place to stand." She read it once, then saved it, turned off the screen, looked at Paige through the rearview mirror. The little girl was sleeping deeply, her face peaceful, not knowing her mother had just finished crying, and not knowing that, from that night on, her mother had changed. On the 6th day, the temperature in Denver dropped below freezing. Meredith started the car so she could run the heater while Paige slept, but the gas needle had already touched the red line. She knew they couldn't stay in the car another night. On the morning of the 7th day, she left Paige in the free play area inside Walmart, telling her daughter to sit still and watch cartoons on the display screen. Then she drove off to look for work. The first place was a small coffee shop in an old neighborhood. The manager looked at Meredith and asked for her address. She said she was in the process of moving. He asked for her social security number to run a credit background check. Meredith knew what the result would be. Half an hour later, he called back. "I'm sorry, we can't hire you." The second place was a grocery store. Same question, same result. Meredith's credit history was a pile of wreckage Kyle had left behind, and every employer who looked at it saw someone untrustworthy. The third place, a bakery, didn't even bother calling her back. At the fourth place, a small restaurant, the manager said it straight. "You don't have a permanent address, you don't have anyone to vouch for you, and your credit is bad. I'd like to help, but I can't." Meredith thanked him, walked out, and sat in the car. 4 places, 4 rejections. Not because she didn't know how to work, but because on paper, she was a woman with the financial record of a fraud, even though she was the one who had been defrauded. She drove back to Walmart to pick up Paige. The little girl ran out, smiling. "Mommy, I watched such a good movie." Meredith smiled too, and lifted her daughter into the car. She didn't know where they would sleep that night. She drove slowly through the suburban streets, with no destination, just driving. Then she stopped in front of a small laundromat at the end of the road. The sign was old, the letters faded, and half the neon light out front was broken, but inside, the lights were on, and warmth seeped through the glass door. Meredith turned off the engine and looked inside. Several washing machines were running, but there were no customers. Behind the counter, an old woman sat reading a newspaper, wearing thick glasses, her silver hair pinned neatly into a bun. Meredith carried Paige, picked up the backpack, and stepped inside. The bell over the door jingled. The old woman looked up. Her eyes moved from Meredith to Paige, down to their worn shoes, up to the backpack on Meredith's shoulder, then back to Meredith's face. In a dry, direct voice, she asked, "Laundry or looking for work?" Meredith was startled. How did you know I was looking for work? The woman folded the newspaper and set it on the counter. Because people who come here to do laundry don't carry a little child in a backpack. Meredith stood still for a moment. Then she said, both. The woman looked at her for a few more seconds, then said, Machine number 3 breaks down a lot. It overflows at night. I need someone to watch the night shift. The pay is low, but there's a place to lie down in the back room, and there's heat. She pointed toward the small door behind the counter. The little girl can sleep there. Meredith didn't ask how much the pay was. Didn't ask about a contract. Didn't ask anything else. She nodded. I'll do it. The old woman nodded back. My name's Ruth. On their first night at the laundromat, Meredith cleaned the back room, a small space about the size of a large closet, with an old folding mattress on the concrete floor, a desk lamp, and a small heater in the corner. Outside, the washing machines ran in a steady rhythm, sounding almost like a lullaby. Paige lay beside her mother, pulling the blanket up to her chin, and said, Mommy, this place is warmer than the car. Meredith kissed her daughter's forehead. Yes, it's warmer now. Paige closed her eyes and fell asleep within minutes. Meredith lay beside her, listening to the washing machines, listening to the heater crackle softly, and for the first time in 7 days, she felt her back loosen, not because life had gotten better, but because that night, her daughter got to sleep somewhere with heat. In the days that followed, Meredith worked the night shift, watching the washing machines, cleaning, and serving late-night customers. During the day, she left Paige at a cheap daycare nearby, then slept for a few hours before picking her up. Ruth didn't ask about Meredith's past, didn't ask about her family, didn't ask about her husband. She only said one thing, one time. The washing machines need someone watching them. The little girl needs someplace warm. That's reason enough. 1 week later, Meredith realized the laundromat's books were unbelievably messy. Bills were piled on top of each other in a shoebox. Money coming in and going out was written on scraps of loose paper, and taxes hadn't been filed for months. She asked Ruth, Would you like me to organize the books for you? I'll do it for free. Ruth looked at her through her thick glasses. You know how? Meredith nodded. That night, after Paige fell asleep, Meredith opened the old laptop, connected to the laundromat's Wi-Fi, and began making a spreadsheet. She entered every number from the pile of bills in the shoebox, sorted them, matched them, and calculated them. The spreadsheet appeared on the screen, neat and clear, line by line, column by column. This wasn't the first time Meredith had done this kind of work, but it was the first time in a very long while that she felt she was doing the very thing she was best at. And she didn't know that spreadsheet would change everything. At that same time, about a 20-minute drive from Ruth's laundromat in downtown Denver, there was a man whose name half the city knew, but very few people dared to say out loud, Knox Sheridan, 33 years old, owner of a chain of fine dining restaurants, an import-export company, and many other things that had no name on any paperwork. On the outside, Knox was a successful businessman. On the inside, he was the man who controlled most of Denver's underground business. One phone call from Knox could make a company lose its biggest contract of the year. One nod from Knox could open a door no one else could open. 10 o'clock at night. A fine dining restaurant in Lodo, second floor VIP room. Knox sat alone at a long table, with an untouched glass of whiskey in front of him and a half-eaten plate of steak. He wasn't waiting for anyone. He never waited for anyone. The door opened. Barrett, Knox's closest man, 35 years old, tall, cold-faced, stepped in with a middle-aged man, the owner of a construction company. His face was pale, sweat beading across his forehead even though the room was air-conditioned. He had come to explain why he was late paying Knox. He began to speak. He talked too much. The market was difficult. Materials had gone up. Workers had quit. Knox didn't look at him. He held his knife and cut the steak on his plate, slowly, evenly. The sound of the knife touching the plate was the only thing that broke through the man's increasingly trembling explanations. At last, Knox set the knife down, wiped his hands with a white cloth napkin, and for the first time that evening, looked at him. I don't listen to reasons. I listen to numbers. The man swallowed and stammered out a number. Knox looked at him for another 3 seconds. Then he gave a slight nod. Barrett opened the door. That was the signal. The meeting was over. The man stood, bowed his head, and hurried out as if he were afraid Knox might change his mind. When the door closed, Barrett turned and asked, "Do you believe him?" Knox picked up the glass of whiskey, took a sip, and set it down. "No, but he's afraid. Men who are afraid pay on time." Barrett didn't ask anything else. 2 weeks later, one afternoon, Barrett stopped by Ruth's laundromat. This was something he did once a month on Knox's orders. Ruth had worked for Knox's mother 30 years earlier, raising Knox when he was little while his mother worked late shifts. Knox never forgot that. Every month, Barrett brought groceries, checked whether Ruth was healthy, checked whether the laundromat had any problems, then reported back to Knox. This time, Barrett walked into the laundromat, placed the grocery bags on the counter, and greeted Ruth. She was still sitting behind the counter as usual, reading the newspaper and drinking tea. But today, something was different. Behind the counter, sitting on a plastic chair pushed close to the wall, was a young woman. Her hair was tied neatly back, her old shirt clean, an open laptop in front of her, and on the screen was a detailed spreadsheet. She was so focused, she didn't even look up when Barrett came in. Barrett looked at her. Then he looked at the spreadsheet on the screen. Only a passing glance, but enough to recognize that it wasn't something an ordinary laundromat attendant could do. He said nothing. He spoke with Ruth for a few moments, left the grocery bags, then walked out. In the car, Barrett called Knox. "Miss Ruth has someone new. A young woman, doing her books for her. Looks cleaner than our own accounting room." On the other end of the line, Knox was silent for 3 seconds. Then he said, "Find out who she is." Barrett didn't ask why. He knew that when Knox wanted to find out about someone, that person had entered his line of sight, and once someone entered Knox Sheridan's line of sight, everything about them would be turned over. A few days later, Barrett placed a folder on Knox's desk in the office at headquarters. Knox opened it and read, "Meredith Cole, 27 years old, graduated with honors in finance from the University of Colorado. Formerly worked as an accountant for a small company before getting married. Ex-husband named Kyle Brennan, who tricked her into signing 4 loans totaling more than $120,000, then ran away. Credit history ruined. The Cole family lived in the suburbs of Denver. Father named Donald, mother named Janet, younger brother named Wesley. Meredith had left her parents' house and was now living in the back room of Ruth's laundromat with her 4-year-old daughter, Paige. Knox read every page, slowly, carefully. When he reached the last page, he folded the folder shut and placed it on the desk. Barrett stood across from him, waiting. Knox looked out the office window at the city of Denver below the building. Then he said, "Let me see Miss Ruth first." 3 days after reading Meredith's file, Knox came to Ruth's laundromat. No warning, no phone call. He drove there, parked in front of the shop, and walked in. The bell over the door jingled. Ruth was sitting behind the counter, folding a stack of towels. She looked up, saw Knox, and wasn't surprised. She was used to Knox appearing now and then without an appointment. That was his way. "Haven't seen you stop by in a while," Ruth said, her eyes still on the stack of towels. Knox pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "How have you been?" "If I can still stand, I'm still fine," Ruth answered, her voice gruff, though her mouth carried the faintest smile. The two of them spoke briefly. Ruth said the laundromat was doing all right. Machine number 3 still broke down often, and there were fewer customers than before, but enough to get by. Knox listened and didn't ask much. Then he asked, his voice gentler, "You have someone new helping you?" Ruth looked at Knox through her thick glasses. "Barrett already told you, didn't he?" Knox didn't answer. Ruth folded the last towel and set it on top of the pile. "The girl's name is Meredith. She doesn't talk much, works well, doesn't complain." She didn't say more. Knox didn't ask more. Right then, the back room door opened. Meredith stepped out to the counter, holding her notebook. She stopped when she saw a stranger sitting across from Ruth. Meredith looked at Knox. Knox looked at Meredith. 3 seconds. No one spoke. Knox saw a young woman with her hair tied neatly back, clear eyes, and a straight back, even though her clothes weren't new. She didn't look afraid. She didn't look curious. She only looked, assessed, then decided this wasn't her business. Meredith saw a man she'd never met before, but the way he sat, the way Ruth spoke to him, the way the whole laundromat seemed to shrink with him in it, all told her this man wasn't a customer coming in to do laundry. She didn't ask. She turned away, walked toward machine number 3, and opened the lid to check it as if nothing had happened. Knox watched her for a few more seconds. Then he turned back to Ruth, finished the tea she poured for him, stood, and left. Their first meeting passed without a single word between them. 1 week later, Knox came back. This time, the laundromat was empty. Ruth wasn't there. She had gone to the county hospital for a routine checkup. Only Meredith sat behind the counter, matching invoices against the spreadsheet on her laptop. The bell over the door rang. Meredith looked up. Knox stepped inside. This time, he didn't sit down. He walked straight to the counter and stood across from her. Meredith set down her pen and looked at him. She recognized the man from the week before. And over the past week, she had asked Ruth about him. Ruth had only said, "Knox Sheridan. He's known me since he was tiny. Beyond that, you don't need to know more." But Meredith knew more. She'd heard the name Knox Sheridan before, in the papers, on the news, in the whispered conversations of people in Denver. She knew who he was, or at least, she knew he wasn't an ordinary man. Knox looked at her. Then he asked, his voice even, with no circling around the point, "Can you read financial statements?" Meredith looked back at him. She could have said yes and stopped there. Safe, modest, unnoticeable. But she didn't choose that. She had lived for 7 days in a car, been rejected by 4 places, eaten a muffin instead of a birthday cake with her daughter, and cried alone in the driver's seat in the middle of the night. She no longer had room for false modesty. "I can read them," she said, her voice calm, but every word clear. "I can fix them. And I can find where people hide money." Knox's expression didn't change. His face stayed cold, his eyes still fixed directly on her. But something shifted in the way he looked at her. Not surprise. Knox wasn't the kind of man who got surprised. It was attention. The kind of attention a man gives when he has just seen what he's been looking for. He didn't say anything else. He took a business card from the pocket of his suit jacket and placed it on the counter, right beside Meredith's notebook. He didn't hand it to her, didn't explain, just set it down. Then he turned and walked out of the laundromat. The bell over the door jingled again, then silence. Meredith looked at the business card on the counter. Black, with silver lettering. Only a name and a phone number, no title. No company address. She didn't pick it up. She looked at it for a while. Then she turned back to the spreadsheet on her laptop and kept working. The business card lay there on the counter beside her notebook all afternoon. Meredith didn't pick it up, but she didn't push it away either. She knew it was there, and she knew, sooner or later, she would have to decide. The business card stayed in the pocket of Meredith's coat for exactly 3 days. She didn't call. She wasn't ready, and she knew she didn't have to call yet. She had work at Ruth's laundromat, a place to sleep, heat, and Paige had somewhere to stay. It wasn't good yet, but it wasn't so desperate that she had to step into the world of a man like Knox Sheridan. Then, on the 4th day, Ruth called Meredith out to the counter. She was holding an envelope, her face ordinary, but her voice different from usual. The landlord sent a notice raising the rent. Double, starting next month. Meredith took the envelope and read it. The new rent was almost twice the laundromat's monthly revenue. Ruth didn't have enough money to pay it. She had been here for 25 years, but the lease had expired the year before, and she had only renewed it verbally with the landlord. Now the landlord wanted the space back for someone else who would pay more. Meredith set the envelope down. "Can you negotiate?" Ruth shook her head. "I called. He wouldn't listen." She looked at Meredith, then looked down. "I'm sorry, child. I can't keep this place much longer. 1 more month at most." Meredith stood behind the counter in silence. She looked toward the corner of the laundromat, where Paige was sitting on the floor, drawing with the box of crayons Ruth had given her. The little girl was drawing a house, with windows, a chimney, and 2 people standing in front of the door, one big and one small. Paige finished the drawing, held it up, and said, "Mommy, this is our house." Meredith smiled. "It's beautiful, sweetheart." Then she turned back, slipped her hand into the pocket of her coat, and felt her fingers touch the business card. She took it out and looked at it. Silver letters against black. Knox Sheridan. A phone number. Nothing else. That night, after Paige fell asleep, Meredith stepped outside the laundromat, stood in front of the glass door, took out her phone, and called. The phone rang 3 times. Then, someone picked up. "Not Knox. Barrett. Who's calling?" Meredith said, "Meredith Cole." Knox Sheridan gave me this number. Silence for 2 seconds. Then Barrett said, "Wait." The call transferred. Then came Knox's voice, even and without expression. "I'm listening." Meredith took a breath. "I'll take the job." She paused for 1 second, then continued. "But I have one condition. My daughter doesn't get touched by anything I do for you. Anything." The other end of the line went silent. Meredith waited. She knew she was setting conditions with a man no one dared to set conditions with. But she also knew that if she didn't say this from the beginning, she would never be able to say it at all. Knox said, "Come to my office tomorrow morning, 207 Larimer Street, 6th floor. Bring the spreadsheet you made for Miss Ruth." Then he hung up. He didn't say agreed. Didn't say I understand. He only told her where to go and what to bring. But he hadn't rejected her condition. And with Knox, not rejecting was already an answer. The next morning, Meredith dropped Paige off at daycare, put on the neatest clothes she owned, took her old laptop, and went to the address Knox had given her. The office building was in Lodo, not the tallest building, but there was security in the lobby and cameras on every floor. She went up to the 6th floor. Barrett was already waiting by the elevator and led her into Knox's office. Knox sat behind his desk, and in front of him was a thick file, nearly 200 pages. He didn't stand, didn't shake her hand, didn't invite her to sit. He pushed the file toward Meredith and said, "Financial records for my restaurant chain. Review them, find the errors. You have 3 days." Meredith took the file, heavy in her hands. She nodded and didn't ask anything else. Barrett took her to an empty desk in the room next door. Meredith sat down, opened the file, and began to read. She read all that day. That evening, back in the small room Ruth had helped her find near the laundromat, she fed Paige, put her daughter to bed, then opened the laptop and kept working until 2 o'clock in the morning. On the second day, she finished. Not 3 days. 2 days, she found 3 holes in the financial system of the restaurant chain. One operating expense had been inflated steadily every month. One food supply contract was priced nearly 40% above market. And one outgoing cash flow had no matching invoice, nearly $50,000 each quarter. Total estimated losses were nearly $200,000. Meredith placed the report on Knox's desk. Knox read it, page by page, slowly. Then he folded it shut and set it down. He looked at Meredith. "You start Monday. No praise, no thanks, no explanation of what she would do, how much she would be paid, or what position she would hold. Just 4 words. You start Monday." Meredith nodded, stood, and walked out. And just as she stepped into the hallway, she saw a man standing at the far end of it, middle-aged, around 40, wearing a gray suit, holding a cup of coffee. He was looking at her, not with curiosity, with assessment. Meredith looked back. The two of them stood about 30 feet apart, and neither spoke. Then the man turned away and stepped into the accounting room at the end of the hall. Meredith didn't know his name yet, but she knew that look. It was the look of someone who felt threatened, and people who felt threatened were always a problem. 1 month passed. Meredith had begun receiving pay from her job with Knox, enough to rent a small room for herself and Paige in the suburbs, close to Paige's daycare. The room wasn't large, only 1 bed, 1 small table, and 1 wardrobe, but it had a window, heat, and a lock on the inside. For the first time in nearly 2 months, Meredith had a place she could call home. But every Sunday afternoon, she still brought Paige to Ruth's laundromat. The laundromat was still open. The landlord had suddenly lowered the rent back to the old amount, and Ruth didn't understand why. She only said, maybe he had second thoughts. Meredith didn't ask further, but she had her own suspicion. That Sunday afternoon, Meredith sat behind the counter, helping Ruth fold towels, just like before. Paige ran back and forth between the rows of washing machines, playing hide and seek with herself, ducking behind machine number 3, then jumping out and laughing in bright little bursts. Ruth sat across from Meredith, folding towels, silent for a while before asking, "Why do you still come here? You've got a good job now. You've got a place to live too. You don't need to sit here folding towels for me anymore." Meredith finished folding the towel in her hands, placed it on the stack, then said, "Because this was the first place where someone didn't ask who I was, didn't ask where I came from. You only asked whether I wanted to work." Ruth looked at her, her eyes blinking behind the thick lenses. Then she gave a dry little laugh. I asked because my washing machine was broken, not because I'm such a good person. Meredith smiled. It was a light, easy smile, the kind she'd rarely had in the past 2 months. Right then, Paige ran over, hugged Ruth's leg, looked up, and asked, "Miss Ruth, do you have candy?" Ruth looked down at the little girl and pretended to be stern. "I'm out today." Paige pouted. Ruth sighed, reached into her pocket, took out a peppermint, and handed it to Paige. "Next time I'll really be out." Paige cried out happily, took the candy, and ran off. Ruth watched the little girl, shaking her head but smiling. Meredith watched too. Her daughter was running between the rows of washing machines, candy in her mouth, hair flying, grinning wide. And the old woman sitting across from her was quietly folding towels, grumbling under her breath, but always keeping candy in her pocket for Paige. Meredith thought, this was what family was. Not the same blood, not promises, but a place where someone stayed when everyone else had left. After 2 months of working for Knox, Meredith didn't talk much, didn't socialize with anyone in the building, and didn't have lunch with her coworkers. She arrived early, left late, and every report she submitted was clean, down to the last line. Knox didn't say more than 10 sentences to her throughout those 2 months, but he read everything she wrote. One afternoon, Knox was meeting with 3 restaurant managers in the conference room on the 6th floor. The meeting was about quarterly revenue, operating costs, and expansion plans. The 3 managers took turns presenting, their voices steady and monotonous, slides projected on the screen. Halfway through, Barrett walked in without saying a word and simply placed a stack of papers on the table in front of Knox. Meredith's monthly report. Knox picked it up and read it while the 3 managers were still speaking. He read it to the end, folded the report, slipped it into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, then turned back to the meeting as if nothing had happened. At the end of the meeting, when the 3 managers were about to leave the room, one of them stopped and asked, "Knox, that new girl in accounting, she reports directly to you instead of going through finance. You trust her?" Knox stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "I don't trust anyone, but numbers don't know how to lie. Neither does she." Then he walked out of the conference room without explaining further. But in that building, there was one man who didn't agree with Knox's answer. Drew. The man Meredith had seen at the end of the hallway on her first day. Drew was 40 years old and had worked as Knox's finance manager for 8 years. 8 years was long enough for a person to know every gap in the system, and Drew knew them, because he was the one who had created them. For 8 years, Drew had been skimming money from Knox's restaurant chain. Not much each time, only a few $1,000s a month, small enough that no one noticed, steady enough to become a large sum over time. What Drew was good at was hiding. Every stolen amount was scattered across dozens of different expense lines, mixed in with legitimate numbers. No one checked closely enough to see it, until Meredith appeared. From the very first week, Drew realized Meredith wasn't an ordinary accountant. She didn't just enter numbers, she read them. She asked questions about lines no one else questioned. She matched invoices against original contracts, checked the gap between market price and purchase price. She was digging in exactly the place where Drew had buried the money. Drew knew that if she continued, it was only a matter of time before she found out. So he made his move first. One night, after the office had emptied, Drew stayed behind and logged into the system with the senior administrator account he had kept since the days when he was the only one managing the finances. He opened 3 files Meredith was working on, 3 expense reports for the 3 largest restaurants. Then, he changed them, added fake expenses on this line, deleted a revenue entry on that line, altered a few numbers in the summary table. He didn't change much, just enough so that when Meredith submitted the report, those numbers wouldn't match. And when they didn't match, Knox would ask. Friday morning, Knox called Meredith up to his office. She stepped inside and saw Knox sitting behind his desk, with the report she had submitted the day before in front of him. Knox didn't invite her to sit. He pushed the report toward her, pointed to one page, and said coldly, "You said you knew how to find where people hide money, so why am I looking at numbers that don't match?" Meredith looked at the report. She looked at the numbers on the page Knox was pointing to, and she knew immediately. These weren't her numbers. She remembered every number she had entered, every line she had checked. What was on this page had been changed. Someone had gone into her file and edited it. Meredith looked up at Knox. She could explain right then. She could say, "Someone changed my file." But she didn't, because without proof, words were only excuses. And Meredith didn't make excuses. She said, "Give me 24 hours." Knox looked at her. His eyes weren't angry, nor were they sympathetic. He only looked, as if weighing whether she deserved those 24 hours. Then he said, 24 hours. Meredith nodded, picked up the report, and walked out of the room. Meredith stepped out of Knox's office, walked down the hallway, past the accounting room, and didn't stop. She went straight to the emergency stairwell at the end of the floor, opened the door, and stepped inside. Concrete stairs. White fluorescent lights. No one there. She went down one floor, reached the third floor landing, then sat down and trembled. Her hands rested on her knees, trembling. Not because she was cold. She trembled because, for the first time since stepping into this building, she didn't know whether she could hold on to the place she had fought for. She sat there with her back against the concrete wall, looking down at the report in her hands. Those numbers weren't hers. Someone had sabotaged her. And if she couldn't prove it within 24 hours, she would lose her job. Losing her job meant losing her pay. Losing her pay meant losing the room. Losing the room meant going back to sleeping in the car with Paige. She wondered, was she fooling herself? Was she really as good as she thought she was? Or was she just a woman trying to cling to anything she could so she wouldn't sink? Had Donald been right when he said she didn't belong anywhere? Meredith opened her phone. She opened her photo gallery and scrolled to a picture of Paige taken the week before at Ruth's laundromat. The little girl was laughing, peppermint stuck to her mouth, one hand raised to show off the candy Miss Ruth had just given her, her eyes squeezed nearly shut because she was laughing so hard. Meredith looked at the photo, then she swiped over. Old messages. The last message Donald had sent her before she left the house, brief and cold, on the night she walked out through the back door. "Don't come back. You don't belong here." Meredith looked at that message, looked back at Paige's picture, then looked at the message again. Two things lay side by side on her phone screen, her daughter's smile and her father's curse. She sat on that stair for 20 minutes. 20 minutes of silence, with only the hum of the fluorescent lights and the sound of her own breathing. Then Meredith stood. She wiped her face with her sleeve, put the phone in her pocket, took the report, walked up the stairs, opened the door, stepped into the hallway, and went straight back to the accounting room. Not because she was no longer afraid, but because she was more afraid of giving up than she was of failing. She sat down at her desk, turned on the computer, and began. She wasn't looking for errors in the report. She was looking for the person who had changed it. Knox's financial system kept access logs. Every time someone logged in, every file they opened, every change they made, and the exact time they did it, were automatically recorded. This was something Drew didn't think she knew, but Meredith knew, because in her very first week at work, she had checked the entire structure of the system. Not because anyone told her to, but because that was the habit of someone good at finance, always knowing which doors were open and who held the keys. Meredith opened the access logs, filtered by the 3 files that had been changed, filtered by time, 48 hours before she submitted the report, line by line, line by line. 10 o'clock at night, nothing. 11 o'clock, she drank coffee and kept reading. Midnight, Barrett passed by the accounting room, saw the light still on, looked in, saw Meredith sitting in front of the screen, said nothing, and kept walking. 1 o'clock in the morning, Meredith found it. The log line clearly showed the administrator account D. Mercer, logging in at 11:42 at night, 2 days before she submitted the report. Opened the expense file for the first restaurant. Edited. Saved. Opened the second file. Edited. Saved. Opened the third file. Edited. Saved. Logged out at 12:15. D. Mercer. Drew Mercer. Meredith sat there looking at the screen. She didn't smile, didn't feel triumphant. She only felt tired, but she had proof. She opened the 3 original files from the automatic backups the system created every night, compared them against the 3 altered files, and printed each page. Her original version on the left, Drew's altered version on the right. Every difference she marked in red pen, along with the printed access log, clearly showing the account, the time, and the action. 2 o'clock in the morning, Meredith shut down the computer, gathered everything into a file, and placed it on the desk. Then she returned to the rented room, checked that Paige was sleeping deeply, lay down beside her daughter, and slept for 3 hours. The next morning, Meredith arrived at Knox's office before working hours. She knocked. Knox was sitting inside, reading something. He looked up. Meredith stepped in and placed the two reports on his desk, the original on the left, the altered one on the right, and the printed access log in the middle. She said, "The person hiding money isn't me." Knox looked at the two reports, looked at the sections marked in red, looked at the access log, the name, D. Mercer, the time, the action, every line clear. When Knox finished reading, he didn't look at Meredith. He picked up the phone and called Barrett. "Give Drew 30 minutes to leave the building. 30 minutes, not 1 minute more." Then he set the phone down, looked at Meredith. "What time did you leave here last night?" 2 o'clock in the morning. Knox was silent. Then he said, "From now on, you report directly to me. Through no one at all." Meredith nodded. She picked up the two reports and walked out. As she passed through the hallway, she saw Drew standing at the accounting room door, his face white, with Barrett beside him. Drew looked at Meredith. Meredith looked back. This time, she didn't need to say anything. Her eyes had said enough. While Meredith was building her place on the 6th floor of the Larimer building, somewhere else in Denver, a larger chessboard was being set. Cherry Creek Golf Course, 10 o'clock in the morning, clear skies. Knox Sheridan stood at the first hole, holding a club, his face as calm as if he were taking a walk. Across from him stood Grant Holloway, 52 years old, owner of the Holloway Group Real Estate Corporation, with a broad smile, a firm handshake, and a voice just loud enough for everyone on the course to hear. On the outside, Grant was a successful businessman, seen in newspapers, at forums, at charity galas. On the inside, he ran an underground business network that competed directly with Knox in the South Denver area. The two men played golf. For the first 9 holes, Grant talked non-stop. The real estate market, a new project in South Denver, opportunities for cooperation, shared benefits. Knox listened. Occasionally, he gave a slight nod, hit the ball, made no comment. At the 9th hole, Grant stopped, looked at Knox, and asked directly, "I've said quite a lot, Sheridan. What do you think of my offer? South Denver is big enough for 2 men. If we cooperate, both of us benefit." Knox set down his golf club. He looked at Grant. For the first time that morning, he looked him directly in the eyes. "I think you're playing on my course, and you're losing." Then Knox turned his back, stepped onto the golf cart, and drove away. He didn't finish the remaining 9 holes, didn't shake hands, didn't say another word. Grant stood alone on the grass, still holding his club, his smile slowly fading. He knew that wasn't an ordinary refusal. It was a declaration of war, and Grant Holloway wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat. He already had a backup piece on the board. He simply hadn't used it yet. That piece was named Wesley Cole. Wesley's story had begun 6 months earlier, before Meredith ever set foot in Knox's building. At the time, Wesley was working as a sales agent for a small real estate company in Denver. The base salary was low, the commission uncertain, but he spent like a man earning 10 times more. A new car, a new watch, every weekend at bars with his friends, paying for the whole group. Where did the money come from? He borrowed it. From friends, from credit cards, from hard money lenders. When the debts began stacking up, Wesley needed money fast. And right then, an offer came from one of Grant Holloway's people. The terms were simple. Wesley would put his name on real estate purchase contracts for a company called Pinnacle Holdings. For each transaction, Wesley would receive a commission 5 times higher than normal. No need to find clients, no need to negotiate. Just sign his name. Wesley wasn't stupid. He worked in real estate, and he knew that a commission 5 times the usual amount never came from a clean transaction. He knew Pinnacle Holdings wasn't an ordinary company. He knew the contracts he signed were unusually high in value, that the buyers and sellers were sometimes the same group of people, and that the money always passed through 3 or 4 layers of companies before reaching its destination. But Wesley chose to close his eyes. He told himself, "I'm only signing my name. The rest has nothing to do with me. I don't know, so I'm not responsible." That was the lie he repeated in his head every time he put his pen to a new contract, and he signed many. In 6 months, Wesley Cole's name appeared on 5 major transactions for Pinnacle Holdings. 5 contracts, 5 signatures, a total value of more than $4 million. On paper, Wesley was the person handling the transactions. In reality, he was only the name Grant Holloway used to turn dirty money into clean money through the legitimate real estate system. Wesley was the cover, and he didn't know that the cover was always the first thing thrown away when everything came apart. Grant knew. He knew it very well. And he knew one more thing. Meredith Cole, Wesley's sister, was working for Knox Sheridan. She was handling financial records for his direct rival. This information reached Grant through his network in Denver, and right away, he saw the opportunity. Wesley was no longer just a money laundering cover. Wesley was leverage. If needed, Grant could force Meredith to bring him Knox's internal financial information. If Meredith refused, Grant only had to send Wesley's entire transaction file to the federal authorities. 5 contracts, 5 signatures, complicity in illegal financial activity. Wesley could spend 15 years in prison. Grant didn't need to do anything right now. He only needed to keep Wesley in the right place at the right time, like a bomb already wired but not yet triggered. And Meredith, sitting on the 6th floor of the Larimer building, checking Knox's books, picking Paige up from daycare every afternoon, thinking that life was finally beginning to settle, had no idea that her younger brother was a chess piece in the hands of her boss's enemy. And that piece could destroy everything she had built. 2 o'clock in the morning, Meredith's phone vibrated on the nightstand. She was lying beside Paige, still awake, her eyes fixed on the ceiling of the rented room. The streetlight outside the window spilled in, casting long streaks of light across the wall. She reached for the phone, an unknown number, a Denver area code, but not one saved in her contacts. She hesitated for 1 second, then answered. On the other end came heavy breathing. Then a woman's voice, choked, trembling. A voice Meredith recognized immediately, even though she hadn't heard it in 2 years. Janet, her mother. Meredith, Janet said, her voice breaking halfway through. Your brother. He's going to die. You have to save him. Meredith sat up in bed, her feet touching the cold floor. She didn't speak right away. 2 years. 2 years since the night she carried Paige out through the back door at 3 o'clock in the morning. 2 years without a call, without a message, without one word asking whether her granddaughter was sick, whether she was hungry, whether she had a place to sleep. And now, at 2 o'clock in the morning, Janet was calling. Not because she missed her daughter, because her son was in trouble. Meredith took a deep breath. Her voice was calm, even, as if she were in the office, not sitting on her bed at 2 o'clock in the morning listening to her mother cry. What did Wesley do? Janet told her. Not in order. Broken into pieces. Sometimes she spoke, then stopped, cried, and spoke again. Meredith sat and listened, putting each fragment together. Wesley had gotten involved with a dangerous group of people. He had signed papers for them, something related to real estate, some kind of transactions Janet didn't fully understand. Last week, someone had come to the house looking for Wesley. He didn't cause trouble, didn't shout, only knocked on the door, spoke to Donald very politely, then handed him an envelope. Inside the envelope were copies of 5 contracts bearing Wesley's signature, along with a small piece of paper that read, 14 days. Or everything goes to the feds. Donald's hands shook after he read it. That was the first time Janet had ever seen her husband shake. Wesley had disappeared from the house since that day, not answering his phone, not replying to messages. Donald called a lawyer he knew, and after reading the file, the lawyer said, if these papers reach the federal authorities, your son could be prosecuted. Complicity in illegal financial activity. The sentence could be up to 15 years. By the time Janet reached that part, she was crying harder. Your father hasn't slept all week. The store is about to get dragged into trouble too, because of the loans Wesley took out in the family's name. Meredith, I don't know what to do. Meredith listened to everything, every word. Then she asked, her voice still even, does Dad know you're calling me? The other end went silent. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. Then Janet said softly, almost in a whisper, no. Meredith closed her eyes. So Donald still wouldn't call her. Even when the family was about to collapse, even when his son might go to prison, he still wouldn't pick up the phone and call the daughter he had driven away. Janet had to call in secret. At 2 o'clock in the morning, behind her husband's back, for the first time in her life, she was doing something her husband didn't know about, and she was doing it for Wesley, not for Meredith. "I'll call you back," Meredith said. Then she hung up. She sat on the bed in the darkness. The phone screen went black, and the room sank into shadow. She didn't turn on the light. She looked out the window. Outside, Denver at night was dark and cold, streetlights flickering, a few cars passing in the distance. Meredith thought about the Cole family, thought about Donald, the man who had said, "You don't belong here," thought about Janet, the woman who had locked the refrigerator, and nodded when Wesley said his sister was bad luck. Thought about Wesley, the younger brother who had taken her room, moved her things into the garage, and smiled coldly when she carried her child away. They had driven her out. Now they needed her. She had every right to leave them to it. No one could blame her. No one had the right to blame her. But then Meredith thought of something else. She thought of Paige. Not Paige now, 4 years old, sleeping deeply beside her. But Paige 10 years from now, 15 years from now, when her little girl was grown, when she understood the world, and one day asked her, "Mommy, back then, when Uncle Wesley was in trouble, did you help?" What would Meredith say? No, because they drove me away? True. Reasonable. No one could blame her. But was that the answer she wanted her daughter to hear? Meredith sat in the darkness for a long while longer. Then she opened her phone, not to call Janet back. She opened the Notes app and read again the line she had written in the car on Paige's birthday night. "Don't let anyone have the power to take my child away anymore. Need money. Need a place to stand." She read it over and over. Then she understood. She wouldn't help Wesley because she forgave him. She wouldn't help because she was weak. She would help because she didn't want Paige to grow up in a family where people abandoned one another. Even if that family had abandoned her first. Meredith turned off her phone. Lay down. She couldn't sleep, but she had decided. The next morning, Meredith went to work as usual. She sat at her desk, turned on her computer, handled the monthly report, and met with Barrett about third-quarter cash flow. No one noticed anything different. But inside her mind, a plan was taking shape. Meredith had two clear choices. One was to run to Knox, tell him everything, and ask him to help her brother. But she knew what that meant. Knox would help, but the price would be that Meredith owed him a favor. And in Knox Sheridan's world, favors were never free. The second was to betray Knox and bring Grant internal financial information in exchange for Wesley's freedom. That was a choice Meredith never considered, not even for 1 second. Not because she was loyal to Knox, but because she knew that if she betrayed him once, she would lose everything she had built, and Paige would be the one who paid the price. So Meredith chose a third path. She would find the evidence herself. That night, after feeding Paige, bathing her, reading her a story, and waiting until her daughter was sound asleep, Meredith sat down at the small table in the rented room, opened her laptop, and began. She didn't hack, didn't break into any system. She did the thing she was best at. She read numbers. She went to the Colorado Business Registration website and looked up Pinnacle Holdings. The company had registered to operate 4 years earlier in the field of commercial real estate, with the executive director listed on paper as Frank Weaver. She wrote that name down. Then she looked up Frank Weaver. Public records showed that Frank Weaver, born in '67, had died 3 years earlier at a hospital in Tucson, Arizona. His death certificate was available in Arizona's public death records system. Meredith stared at the screen. Pinnacle Holdings was still operating, still buying and selling million-dollar properties under the name of a man who had been dead for 3 years. She continued. On the first night, she searched every real estate transaction related to Pinnacle Holdings in Denver County's public records system. 14 transactions in 2 years. Total value of more than $12 million. All purchased with cash or transfers from corporate accounts. On the second night, she traced the money backward through business registration records. Pinnacle Holdings bought real estate, then resold it to another company named Ridgeline Capital. Ridgeline sold it again to Summit West LLC. Summit West then sold it to the final buyer. 3 layers of companies. With each sale, the price rose. The money moved through 3 transfers, each one looking more legitimate than the last. In the end, The money landed in the main account of Holloway Group, clean on paper, but its origin was dirty money. On the third night, Meredith found the final link. She cross-checked the names of the directors of all three companies, Pinnacle, Ridgeline, and Summit West. All of them were retired or no longer active in the industry. Two of them had the same registered address, the same virtual office in the Denver suburbs, and the 5 most recent transactions by Pinnacle Holdings had been signed by Wesley Cole, her brother. Meredith printed everything, page by page, arranged it into a file. She looked at the clock. 3 o'clock in the morning. She looked over at Paige sleeping, then looked back at the file on the table. The next morning, Meredith arrived at Knox's office earlier than everyone else. She knocked. Knox was sitting inside, a cup of coffee on the desk, reading a report. He looked up. Meredith stepped in and placed the file on his desk. Knox looked at the file, then looked at Meredith, then looked back at the file. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he opened his desk drawer, took out another file, thicker than hers, and set it beside Meredith's. "Do you know what this is?" Knox asked. Meredith looked. Knox's file had Holloway written on the cover in pen, and it was nearly twice as thick as the one she had brought. But when Knox opened it, Meredith saw that Knox's file contained a great deal of information about Grant, about restaurants, about his network of connections, but it was missing the most important part, evidence of transactions through shell companies. The evidence Meredith had just found. Knox said, "I've been looking for this for 2 years. My whole team has been looking. No one found it. You found it in 3 nights." Meredith said nothing. Knox read her file. Page by page. Pinnacle Holdings. Frank Weaver was dead. 3 layers of companies. The money trail. Wesley Cole. When he finished, he folded it shut. Looked at Meredith. "Do you know what that means? It means you're more dangerous than you think. And dangerous people." Knox paused for one beat. "I like keeping close more than leaving far away." Meredith looked at him. She knew that sentence wasn't only about work, but she didn't ask more. She only said, "My brother. His name is on 5 transactions. If this file reaches the federal authorities, he'll be prosecuted." Knox looked at her, then said, his voice even, "Your brother, I'll handle, not because you asked, but because Grant Holloway touched someone of mine, and he has to pay for that." Meredith asked, not intentionally, the question slipping out on its own. "I'm someone of yours?" Knox didn't answer. He stood, buttoned his suit jacket, walked past her, and left the room. The door closed. Meredith stood alone in Knox's office, looking at the door that had just shut. And for the first time since stepping into this building, she wasn't thinking about work. Knox didn't wait long. That very afternoon, Barrett drove to the Holloway Group office in South Denver. He wore a black suit, carried a brown envelope in his hand, walked through the reception lobby without stopping, and went straight into Grant Holloway's office. The secretary stood up, meaning to block him, but after seeing Barrett's face, she sat back down. Barrett placed the envelope on Grant's desk, stood straight, and said exactly one sentence. "Knox sends his regards. You have 2 choices. Leave Denver within 30 days, or this entire file lands on a federal prosecutor's desk Monday morning." Grant looked at Barrett. Then he looked at the envelope. He opened it slowly, still holding on to his calm expression. Inside were copies of everything Meredith had found. Pinnacle Holdings, Frank Weaver, dead for 3 years, 3 layers of companies, the money trail, 14 transactions, a total value of more than $12 million. Every page, every number, every signature, Grant read. And as he read, his face slowly changed, not fear. Grant Holloway wasn't the kind of man who scared easily, but he understood that this wasn't an empty threat. This was real evidence, enough to put him in prison for a very long time. Barrett didn't wait for a reaction. He gave a nod, turned, and walked out. That night, Grant called Knox. Knox answered in his office, his feet propped on the desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand. Grant spoke, his voice trying to stay calm, but carrying a sharp edge beneath it. "You think I'll run? You think Grant Holloway is the kind of man who packs up and leaves because someone threatens him once?" Knox said nothing for 3 seconds. Then he answered, his voice as even as if he were talking about the weather. "I don't think. I know. 29 days, Mr. Holloway." Then he hung up. Grant sat in his office, still holding the phone, staring at the envelope on the desk. He was a man who had forced others to leave the city, bought land out from under people, and laughed when his rivals went bankrupt. But tonight, for the first time, he was the one being forced. And he knew Knox Sheridan wasn't joking. 1 week later, Grant Holloway sold every piece of real estate he owned in Denver through a middleman agent. The Holloway Group office closed. The employees were dismissed. Grant left Denver without announcing where he was going. No noise, no resistance. He simply disappeared, as if he had never existed in the city at all. The news reached Knox through Barrett on Friday afternoon. In the office on the 6th floor, Barrett stood in front of the desk and gave a brief report. Holloway has left Denver. Assets sold off. Pinnacle Holdings has stopped operating. Knox sat behind the desk and gave a slight nod. He poured whiskey into his glass and took a sip. "Clear the board. This game is over." Barrett nodded. Then he asked, "What about Meredith's brother, Wesley Cole? His name is still on 5 contracts." Knox set the glass down. "Let him go. He isn't worth keeping." To Knox, Wesley was a small fish caught in the net meant for a bigger one. The big fish had been taken down. The small fish wasn't worth the time, but for Wesley, it wasn't that simple. When Grant left Denver, his network collapsed, and Wesley was the weakest link. The real estate company where he worked fired him immediately when the news broke. His personal assets were frozen pending investigation. The name Wesley Cole in Denver real estate now meant trouble. No one wanted anything to do with him. Wesley lost his job, lost his money, lost his friends, lost all the things he had once thought he had. He drove the rented car back to his parents' house in the Denver suburbs. He stood in front of the door and knocked. Donald opened it. He looked at his son, looked at his rumpled clothes, his red eyes, the way his body sagged. 2 years earlier, when Meredith had stood in this exact place with Paige in her arms, Donald had opened the door and said, "Only for a little while." But today, when Wesley stood there, Donald said something different. "You caused this yourself. You deal with it yourself." Then he closed the door. Wesley stood in front of the closed door. The house where he had once been the favored son. The child who brought blessing and fortune. The child his parents protected at any cost. Now that door was closed in his face. And the person who closed it was his father. 1 week after the day his father closed the door in Wesley's face, rain fell over Denver. Not a quick shower that came and passed, but the kind of rain that stretched from afternoon into evening, steady, cold, soaking into everything. Meredith was sitting in the rented room, feeding Paige dinner. The little girl sat on the chair, her legs swinging, telling her mother about daycare that day, how Tommy had brought a plastic turtle that could swim, and the teacher had shown it to the whole class. Meredith listened, smiled, nodded, and fed her daughter a spoonful of soup. Then came a knock at the door. Soft, hesitant. Not like Barrett's knock, or Ruth's, or anyone Meredith knew. She looked at Paige and said, "Keep eating, sweetheart. Mommy's going to see who it is." Paige nodded and held the spoon, feeding herself. Meredith stood, walked to the door, and opened it. Wesley stood in the hallway, soaked from head to toe. His hair stuck to his forehead, his shirt wrinkled, mud clinging to the cuffs of his pants. He was much thinner than the last time Meredith had seen him, 2 years earlier, when he had leaned against the bedroom door, smiled coldly, and watched his sister carry her child out through the back door in the dark. Now he was standing here, in front of his sister's rented room, his eyes red, his lips trembling. Meredith looked at her younger brother. Then she stepped into the hallway and pulled the door partly closed behind her, just enough so Paige couldn't see and couldn't hear. She stood facing Wesley in the narrow hall, rain pattering on the awning above. Wesley opened his mouth. He wanted to say something, but no words came. He looked at his sister, and in his eyes, Meredith saw something she had never seen in Wesley before. Real shame. Not the kind of shame that came from being caught, the kind of shame that came from looking back at yourself and realizing who you had been. Then Wesley dropped to his knees, right there in front of the rented room, on the wet hallway floor, with rain blowing in from the awning. Both knees hit the floor, his head lowered, his shoulders shook. Meredith looked at her brother kneeling in the rain. The brother who, 2 years earlier, had taken her room, moved her things into the garage, and told their mother that his sister was bad luck. The brother the whole family had treated as a blessing, as the child who brought good fortune. Now he was kneeling here, thin, soaked, trembling, outside the door of the sister he had abandoned. Meredith didn't hug him, didn't pull him up right away. Didn't cry, she said, her voice even. Not cold, but not warm either. Stand up! Kneeling doesn't solve anything. Wesley didn't stand. He said, his voice shaking and broken. Sis, I'm sorry. I know I don't deserve to say that, but I don't know what else to say. Meredith looked at him for a few more seconds. Then she turned back into the room, took a plastic chair, brought it out into the hallway, and set it down. She said, Stand up, sit here, tell me what you did. Wesley wiped his face with his wet sleeve, stood, and sat down on the chair. Meredith leaned against the opposite wall, arms crossed, watching him. And for the first time in his life, Wesley told the truth. No bragging, no excuses, no blaming anyone else. He told her about signing papers for Grant Holloway, about the commission 5 times higher than normal, which he knew was unusual but accepted anyway. About the nights he lay in bed knowing he was doing wrong, but telling himself, just one more time, then I'll stop. About the debt piled on top of debt because he spent faster than he earned. About the evening, someone came to the house, knocked on the door, handed their father an envelope, and their father's face turned pale as he read it. About the night Wesley disappeared from the house, wandering through a cheap hotel for 3 days, too afraid to answer the phone. And about the moment he came home, knocked on the door, and his father opened it and said, You caused this yourself. You deal with it yourself. Then closed the door. Wesley finished telling her. Silence. The rain kept falling. The hallway was narrow, the light a pale yellow, and the 2 siblings sat an arm's length apart. Meredith listened to all of it, every word. Then she said, Do you know why I helped you? Wesley shook his head, not daring to look up. Not because I forgive you. Not yet. Maybe it'll take me a very long time to forgive you. Maybe I never will. She paused. I helped because of my daughter, because of Paige. I don't want her growing up in a family where people abandon one another, even if that family abandoned me first. Wesley looked down at the floor. Tears mixed with rainwater and ran down his face. He didn't wipe them away. He only sat there, head lowered, shoulders shaking, and for the first time, he had no words to defend himself, no smile to hide behind. Meredith looked at him for a while longer. Then she said, her voice softer but clear, But you have to stand back up on your own. I've carried my part. I can't carry anyone else's too. Wesley nodded. He didn't speak. The brother and sister sat in the hallway, rain falling beyond the awning, the yellow light dim around them, and neither said anything more. There was no scene of embracing and crying, no easy forgiveness, only truth, rain, and 2 people who had once lived under the same roof but had never truly understood each other, now sitting beside each other for the first time without pretending. 1 week before opening night, Barrett called Meredith at noon. It wasn't about work. He spoke in a normal voice, as if he were reporting the weather. There's something I think you should know. Your father, Donald Cole, has been going to Miss Ruth's laundromat every morning. He sits in the waiting chair, drinks coffee, and doesn't wash anything. It's been more than 2 weeks. Meredith held the phone and said nothing. Barrett added, Miss Ruth asked him what he was there for. He looked around the laundromat and said, I'm just sitting here for a while. Nothing more. Miss Ruth poured him more coffee. Meredith didn't ask anything else. She thanked Barrett and hung up. She sat at her desk, looking out the window. Her father was sitting in Ruth's laundromat, the place where she had once mopped the floor, the place where Paige had once run between rows of washing machines, asking Miss Ruth for candy, the place where she had once sat behind the counter, fixing the books for free, building her first spreadsheet on the old laptop. Donald was sitting there every morning, saying nothing, explaining nothing, just sitting in the place where his daughter had once sat, as if he were trying to understand something he had missed for far too long. Meredith didn't go to see her father, not yet. She didn't know what she would say if she stood in front of him, so she left it alone. Then, opening night came. The Brown Palace Hotel, 2nd floor, ballroom. Meredith had known this scene was coming. She had imagined it many times in her mind after Knox told her she would attend as the official chief financial officer of the restaurant chain. But imagining was one thing. Walking in was another. When Meredith passed through the main doors with Knox and Paige, when the conversations in the room quieted, when she felt more than 200 pairs of eyes looking at her, she didn't think about power position, or the place she had earned. She thought about that 3 o'clock morning 2 years earlier, when she carried Paige out through the back door of the house in the suburbs, a backpack on her back, not a dollar in her pocket. And now she was standing here. Donald's wineglass fell to the floor and shattered. Meredith heard it, but she didn't look over right away. She tightened her hold on Paige's hand and kept walking. Knox walked beside her, placing one hand lightly on the back of her chair as she sat at the reserved table at the front of the ballroom. A small gesture, but the whole room saw it, and the whole room understood. The woman sitting at this table was not an ordinary guest. Barrett walked through the ballroom to table number 14, where the Cole family sat. He placed a white envelope on the table in front of Donald, then turned away without saying a word. Donald looked at the envelope. Janet looked at her husband. Wesley looked down at the table. Donald opened the envelope and pulled out a sheet of paper. An official appointment letter. Meredith Cole, Chief Financial Officer, Sheridan Group restaurant chain. There was a seal. There was a signature. There was the company logo. This wasn't a gift, not a favor. This was a position Meredith had earned through 2 years of relentless work, through nights spent sitting until 2 o'clock in the morning checking books, through exposing Drew, through 3 nights spent uncovering Grant Holloway's shell company network, through everything she had poured into her life since the night she called the number on that business card. Donald finished reading. His hand dropped, the paper lying on the table. He didn't look at Meredith. He looked at Paige. Right then, Paige saw her grandfather. The little girl was sitting beside her mother, her legs swinging from the tall chair, her round eyes taking in the bright ballroom. And when her gaze touched table number 14, she recognized him. "Grandpa," Paige waved, her clear little voice ringing through the now quiet ballroom. "Grandpa, this place looks just like a castle." Those words, just like a castle. The first time the little girl had said that, at the beginning of the story, it had only been the innocent remark of a 6-year-old child. But now, after everything that had happened, after 2 years, after the 3 o'clock morning, after the birthday in the car, after Ruth's laundromat, after Drew, after Grant, after Wesley kneeling in the rain, after the album of 27 years, those words carried 10 times the weight. Donald looked at his granddaughter. His lips moved. He wanted to say something, wanted to call her name, wanted to say, "Grandpa's here," but the words wouldn't come, because he knew that after everything he had done, he had no right to say anything to this child. He was the one who had changed the locks. He was the one who had said, "I don't know what you brought into this house." He was the one who had let his daughter carry his granddaughter away at 3 o'clock in the morning without opening the bedroom door. Wesley sat beside him, his face pale, looking down. Janet gripped her husband's hand, her eyes red. Meredith looked at her father. 2 years. For the first time in 2 years, they looked at each other. Meredith wasn't angry. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She only looked at him, then said softly, "Dad." Paige wants to say hello to her grandpa. Donald looked at his daughter, then at Paige. The little girl had slipped down from the chair and was running toward table number 14, her small feet tapping across the marble floor. Paige ran over, wrapped her arms around her grandfather's leg, looked up and smiled. "Grandpa, you're so handsome." Donald looked down at the granddaughter hugging his leg. The granddaughter he hadn't kept. The granddaughter he had never called to ask about. His 6-year-old granddaughter, smiling, holding on to his leg, thinking she was standing inside a castle. He placed his hand on her head. His hand trembled badly. And in a ballroom filled with 200 people, not one person said a word. After the party, Meredith didn't go back to her parents' house. She didn't go home with Knox. She carried Paige, who was already deeply asleep, out to the car, buckled her into the back seat, then sat down behind the wheel. She drove out of the Brown Palace Hotel parking lot, through downtown, through the brightly lit streets. But she didn't drive back to the rented room. She drove to Ruth's laundromat. The laundromat was closed. The lights were off. The old sign, with its faded letters, sat still in the darkness, and the half-broken neon light no longer flickered. Meredith parked right in front of the laundromat and turned off the engine. She sat in the car, looking through the glass door into the shop. Ruth's old counter, where the old woman had sat reading newspapers and folding towels. The rows of washing machines, where Paige had once played hide and seek by herself and laughed in bright little bursts. The small door in the back, leading to the tiny room with the folding mattress on the concrete floor, where mother and daughter had slept on their first night after 7 days of living in a car. Paige slept soundly in the back seat. She was still wearing her new floral dress, her neatly braided hair already coming a little loose, one hand holding a flower someone had given her at the party. Meredith looked at her daughter through the rearview mirror. This little girl, 1 year earlier, had sat in the back seat of this car in a Walmart parking lot, blown out a match, stuck into a chocolate muffin, and wished for her mother not to be sad. This little girl had eaten half the muffin, then given the other half to her mother, chocolate on her mouth, grinning wide, not knowing that it was the poorest and most beautiful birthday party Meredith had ever seen. Now the little girl slept in a new floral dress, holding a flower in her hand, her face peaceful, after a night she had called a castle. Meredith looked at her daughter. Then she whispered, so softly only she could hear it, "Mommy kept her promise. No one can take you away from me anymore." She sat there for a few more minutes, looking at the laundromat, looking at her daughter, looking at her own hands on the steering wheel, the hands that had once trembled on the third-floor stair landing, had once written a plan on the back of a bill, had once wiped away tears in the driver's seat at midnight, had once placed 2 reports on Knox's desk and said, "The person hiding money isn't me." Those hands now held the steering wheel, steady. Meredith started the engine, turned on the headlights, looked forward. Then she drove away. Meredith Cole wasn't someone who brought bad luck, nor was she someone who brought good luck. She was only a woman who had been pushed into a corner, and instead of collapsing, she had stood back up. A person's worth doesn't lie in the things other people attach to them, unlucky or lucky, blessing or disaster, burden or good fortune. It lies in how you stand when you've been knocked down, and the way you treat the people who once hurt you. That is what reveals who you truly are, more than any title the world gives you. Sometimes, the one called a burden is the very person carrying the whole family. And sometimes, the strongest apology isn't spoken in words, but in the silence of someone sitting where you once sat, drinking coffee alone every morning, trying to understand what they saw far too late. If this story touched you, please hit like and share it so more people can hear it. We'd truly love to know how you feel after this story, so please leave a comment and share the feelings deep in your heart. We always read and listen to every line. If you'd like to walk with us through the stories to come, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the new videos every day. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and a peaceful soul each day. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.